Hey there everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Astrology Classroom, and we're continuing with our discussion of analyzing aspects of compatibility charts in an introduction. And this is definitely supposed to be a companion video to the longer video talking about the primaries. Alright, when we talk about the Moon, we talk about Venus, we talk about Mars, and to a lesser extent Mercury. As far as primary romantic expressors, definitely a big deal there. But I wanted to also throw in this companion talking about outer planets. Now I do want to remind everybody that this is getting kind of heady, and in order to make it as compact as possible, I'm going to have to refer you out to other videos that I have done discussing aspects, planetary overviews. Those are all here on Patreon. And please don't forget to check out the playlist about sun sign compatibilities and whatnots, and even going a little bit further into signs themselves as lovers. On my Scarlet Moon horoscope page, there's a special playlist about that too. So that can talk about love languages and all that kind of good stuff, giving you a really good rundown, getting you up to speed. So in this video I want to talk about the outer planets, in particular Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and Saturn. Jupiter will come into play, but Jupiter is fairly cut and dry across the board, so we won't be spending too much time on him because he's pretty cool. Now, when we talk about compatibility, remember, as I said before, just because there may be a snag or something seems to be a bit disharmonious, it does not mean that the relationship will fail. Just like I've seen perfectly harmonious things come apart due to the choices people make with their free will. So it's always important to keep that in mind. However, again, it's all about, what the pieces are there that we can build a relationship from are doing, how they're interacting, how healthy they are. So let's talk about Jupiter in a rundown really quick. Remember, we're talking about aspects, conjunctions, oppositions, trines, sextiles, and squares. Jupiter by itself is a very harmonious planet. It does very, very seldom, if ever, create negativity, even in challenging aspects such as oppositions and squares. What Jupiter does is Jupiter in love works as sort of a pleasure center. Speaking of fun, recreation, whether it's recreation in terms of play, recreation in terms of sexuality, recreation in terms of just the overall morale and exuberant fun in the relationship itself. And it tends to amplify or expand the aspect and the planets it's related to in a way that gives them more fertility and more oomph to them. So if we have, say, a situation where a person's Venus is conjunct a person's Jupiter, and, person A's Venus is conjunct a person's Jupiter, then that indicates that their love expression to them tends to, be more deeply felt and will elicit, more pleasure from that experience. If a person's Venus is opposed to a person's Jupiter, then that can indicate a situation where the opposite effect can happen, but not necessarily in a bad way. Sometimes an opposite of a love language can still be a fun love language. For instance, if a person is really into quiet time, quality time together, okay, we're talking about snuggling, not too much heavy conversation, really just kind of spending that bonding out for a hike, all of that good stuff. Opposite somebody's Jupiter, which may be in a place that asks for a bit more talk, a bit more verbal affirmation, more consistent communication, lots of text, lots of things like that, it will elicit that response, that opposite, I guess you could say, from the other person. Now, depending on how well the other areas of that person's chart link up with that love language, eliciting a bigger response can be very, very good because, person A with the Venus opposition could actually have a Moon or a Mars in an area that receives that very well. Or that person with the Jupiter actually, again, responding in their big way, also feels more fulfilled, feeling like there's more they can contribute. So the opposition can be navigated with great ease. Squares are very interesting because, unlike the opposition, again, we're getting two things at the same time that may not necessarily always blend. Again, there's a competition, but it's how do we get both to work at the same time. Not this or that, or this then that, but this and that, going into the good, lovey, happy, safe, satisfying goodness all at once. So, say somebody's moon is square somebody's Jupiter. Okay, the excess of energy of that Jupiter and the square to the moon can indicate that, while a person's emotional needs may be square to what that person's Jupiter does by, bringing in more fun, more pleasure, more exuberance, it may not necessarily hit the mark all the time. What that person with the moon and that person and the other person with the Jupiter need to understand is that they can do both at the same time. And that's all that needs to be understood. It's the illusion that we can't have it at the same time that could create a problem here. Jupiter square to Venus can indicate, maybe too much of a good thing every once in a while that this couple may need to pay attention to. Things could get a little bit expensive, a bit time-consuming, a bit high maintenance, but all at the same time very, very pleasurable and very, very fun. Jupiter square to Mars can indicate maybe a little bit of a hairy area, however. With a Jupiter-Mars square, we tend to see, again, that problem-solving, passion, how do we confront our issues kind of energy. Square to Jupiter can indicate a situation where a person may have an issue where they take I guess you could say, the lightening up a bit personally. Sometimes people don't want to have the poison taken out of the snake right away. Especially in a dire situation, they might interpret the actions to mitigate or create more light or to create more of a softness as a critique, and they should not. But, we all do. Sometimes it's like, we're like, look, it feels like you're not taking this very seriously. It feels like you're not respecting the severity of the situation. Truth is, Jupiter square to Mars, not necessarily always, but, what can happen is we have to just see the good intentions behind it. Jupiter square to Mars energy can also indicate possibly things being taken a bit in a disproportionate way. Again, where things are maybe disproportionate in terms of a person and their partner not seeing the same proportions of certain problems all the time. And one thing that may seem cataclysmic or catastrophic to one, not so to the other. And so as long as they can work that out and become aware and sensitive and responsible for, their part in making sure that everyone feels cool, calm, and collected, we're going to be good to go. Jupiter trines and sextiles are fairly self-explanatory. It will amp up the support and the goodness coming out of any planet. A harmonious connection with a trine, all areas benefit at once, and again, a support aspect from a sextile, that Jupiter energy will reach over into that other house and give it a boost. Either way, we have lovely aspects with Jupiter for the most part, and nothing really too, freaky-deaky to worry too much about. Just what's important to remember with Jupiter is that for the most part, its primary duty is to, to basically empower, expand, and build on what that aspect and what that planet already is. It can make things bigger and more awesome and more wonderful, or it can sometimes expand to the point where, again, a person might feel like something is being watered down, or maybe being a bit diluted or disrespected. So it's important to always keep a sense of proportion with Jupiter, but again, for the most part, it's almost always a good thing. Let's have a look at something a bit more different. Let's talk about Saturn. Saturn, as a relationship discussion, is very different. Saturn isn't quintessentially a love compatibility planet, but Saturn talks about our limitations as well as our values, and sometimes our sense, the challenges that we're going through in life, what we're learning to become masters of and authorities of. And in a love chart, sometimes what can happen is that Saturn can actually prove to show that this person will be an asset in this journey or in this quest to this person, or this person may be a detriment or a liability in this journey for this person. And, either way, again, if a person knows how to handle it, they'll be just fine. I think that one of the biggest issues that comes up is that we just expect our partner to be in everything and all things for us. But, sometimes those feelings can be exacerbated if Saturn's in a tough spot. And, you know, when I think about the good stuff about Saturn, I think about the trines and the sextiles and how that really, really plays into the other. When it comes to a person's Saturn in astrology, we can also look at their ethics, okay, their rules, you know, their beliefs about right and wrong. And a lot of the times when we talk about Saturn ethics, you know, this can talk a lot about going back to childhood for this person as well. When we look at Saturn in a conjunction, this can actually be very pleasant, but also a challenge at the same time. It can strike all the right and wrong chords at once. It's just a big hit. And what happens is that Saturn will challenge the planet it conjuncts and try to maybe commandeer or take the reins with that challenge, with that planet, excuse me. And if in the right hands, it may actually make things better, and in the wrong hands, it might make things worse. So it could go either way. Saturn conjunct a person's Venus can indicate, you know, if person A's Saturn conjuncts person B's Venus, then that can create a situation where on the plus side, it's teaching person B's Venus how to express that love language in stronger, healthier, more effective and quality ways. In a negative, however, that conjunction can also indicate that person A's Saturn conjunct person B's Venus can also indicate, well, there's going to be a fight going on between that Venus and Saturn energy. Sometimes what can happen is a person's expression of love is kind of, you know, maybe scrunched down a little bit. You know, it's like, I don't get to express my love my way. I don't get to speak my mind my way. I don't get to do it my way. You know, because that Saturn is saying it's not going to do anything, or maybe it's going to do something, but it's going to do the wrong thing, or it's just, there's something is out of balance. The same can go with Saturn conjunct the Moon. You know, whether it's we're helping our needs get met in a good way, or it's we're prohibiting the meeting of needs due to that consistent constraint of Saturn. It all depends on, again, what's going on in the rest of the chart. Saturn conjunct another person's Mars can be a very difficult aspect to a certain degree, because it usually can show up in a relationship where one person is the problem solver and that one person is the problem solver alone. That can usually lead the person with the Saturn to try and take control as the authority, the sort of the cop of the relationship. And it can also lead the person with the Mars to defer to the other person, to be the authority and the boss and the leader or the cop of the relationship. And, you know, that deference to to authority that you make your partner can again create an imbalance, you know, and then we don't have a partnership of equals. So it's important to keep that in mind. On the good, Saturn conjunct Mars, though, can help control both people when it comes to, say, maybe the Saturn helping the Mars person control their temper, and the Mars person helping the Saturn person know when they need to, you know, raise their temper a little bit to meet the moment. So again, balance is key. Saturn conjunct the Mercury can function a lot the same way, where we have maybe a person choosing not to use their voice as much as they want to hear the other person's voice. They don't raise their opinion, they choose to be, one relationship partner maybe loses interest in expressing themselves and chooses to be a complete follower. And that can build resentment. You know, people will develop resentment for feeling like the leader alone in a relationship where we should be a partnership. Sometimes that Saturn person may feel like they are not getting any contributions, that they're kind of with a partner who's more like their ward than somebody who is, you know, again, a partner in life. However, again, if kept in balance, that Mercury can be a good thing. It can teach the Saturn person when they're doing things too slow, being a bit too careful or overly cautious, and when they need to actually speed up their progress in whatever they're working on, because sometimes Saturn can really go at an inefficient pace, and that Mercury can help out. When it comes to trines and sextiles, Saturn is pretty clear-cut across the board. Saturn will basically come in as sort of the be-all, end-all fixer. One of the biggest things about Saturn in trines and sextiles is that it is there to help, right? It's there to improve and work on. The energy flows easily and harmoniously to the other planet, whether it's the Moon, the Venus, the Mars, the Mercury, whatever. But one of the biggest things that we got to pay attention to is that sometimes Saturn's more interested in solving instead of processing. So even though we've got easy aspects and, for the most part all intentions are well and good and everything's flowing beautifully, it's important that those relationships with Saturn trine Moon, for instance, or Saturn trine Mars, that we make sure that we're not just trying to fix everything and we're learning to understand as well. Otherwise, we might not necessarily be getting the lesson, and sometimes that happens. We finish the book, we don't learn the moral of the story. We go through the experience, we don't learn how to prevent it from happening the next time. Saturn in a trine can often make things a bit too easy, and sometimes Saturn's sextile to anything can also be a solution without a focus on the education. And so it's important to make sure that we're not doing just a firm grip on results and net results when we have that in our relationship, but all in all it's still actually fairly supportive because we have this big problem solver running in. Saturn oppositions tend to create, again, not only competitiveness, but at the same time we get into that ethical issue. Oftentimes, couples will have a lot of problems with Saturn opposite Moon, Venus, or Mars, or even Mercury, because the person who has the Venus, Mars, Mercury, or Moons, whatever's going on with that, is actually going to be in contest and competition with the Saturn holders' sense of ethics and moral priorities. How a person expresses their love may be something that Saturn feels is intrinsically not right for them, doesn't resonate with them, or they may believe that there is something wrong about it. And how that plays out could be true or untrue, depending on what's going on. Now, if, say, person A's Saturn is opposed by person B's Moon, then we have a situation where Moon's needs are seen as maybe unhealthy to Saturn. And who's right and who's wrong here? Well, that's why we have so many planets and so many aspects in the chart. Again, if you're going to turn things black and white, astrology is too complicated. And that's not something you can do. So we'd have to look and see, okay, well, if Saturn person has, say, another planet like Mercury square their Saturn during that time, or a transit like Mars, a transiting Mars, square their Saturn, then for that instance it might seem like the Saturn person's probably under, a lot of planetary pressure, and maybe they're judging a bit too harshly. Maybe they're taking things to a level where they're maybe trying to make their morals or their values universally applicable where they can't be. However, maybe it's the Moon that's challenged, not the Saturn. And if the person's Moon is challenged during that period, then maybe there is something this person is doing with their emotional needs, or the projection of their emotional needs, that is creating an unhealthy desire or unhealthy request or expectation on the Saturn person in the relationship. If it would be in the natal chart, I would look at both the Saturn and the Moon person and be like, there are some things you both need to work on in your conditioning. If Mars is square Saturn in the Saturn person's natal chart, I'd be like, look, maybe we're being a little bit too severe here, and maybe we are having to deal with some very, very strict conditioning that is making us feel like something is unhealthy when it's not, it's just foreign. However, if, say, it's the Moon person's Mars square their Moon, I would be like, you need to be careful of excess here. You may be dealing with a situation that you feel is healthy, but you were taught to believe that something unhealthy was healthy, and you need to fix that too. So it can be a lesson in and of itself, but a hard one. Squares are very similar. We talk about ethical issues and senses of right and wrong being challenged, but everyone does have a way to get their way. Remember, squares, we can make it all work out. And so, whereas a Moon square Saturn and a Moon opposite Saturn may have the same challenges to needs versus ethics, or Venus square Saturn, Venus opposite Saturn, wants or expressions versus ethics versus personal values. In an opposition, it's kind of like, look, you're going to have to do some reflecting. Is this fair or unfair? In a square, it's kind of like, your lesson is, so what? Your lesson to learn is, so what? You're not the other person. Don't look at the partner as a projection of yourself. You know, don't take ownership of your partner, work with your partner. Yes, their expression may be counter to what you believe to be right, or be, you know, maybe it goes against some fiber or some, you know, some conditioning of yours. You got to decide to make them work, because sometimes bittersweet is a good flavor, sweet and sour is a good flavor, sweet and spicy is definitely a good flavor. And so it may be something to play around with. How do we mix these dissonant values or dissonant expressions into something that works, instead of making it, you know, a tribulation that doesn't have to be one? Moving on to Uranus. Uranus is about our, you know, how we break the mold. You know, it's the random, right? It's the revolutionary in our astrology chart. And when it comes to Uranus and love, we talk about where people break the molds, if it's interacting. Sometimes with Uranus, in harmonious aspects, like a trine or a sextile, this can help the needs of a person, or the expressions of a person, or the problem-solving abilities of a person, or the communications of a person, help the Uranus person break free of a constraint, whether it's a social constraint, a mental constraint, an emotional constraint. And the same can be said for sextiles. Maybe that Venus expression helps somebody get over a limitation. Maybe it helps them get past an insecurity or a bit of shyness that, you know, has been holding them back. Sometimes we have a situation going on where a person's Uranus is in conjunction with another one. And all of a sudden we've got this pair, this powerful pair of people, where a person's, like say a person's Venus is conjunct somebody's Uranus. Both of them combine and we have a very unique relationship expression that comes out, where one person is actually most likely going to adopt the expression of the other. Or they're both going to completely abandon their usual love languages, or evolve them into something very, very similar and harmonious. What they're going to do, they could come with two different things, and then all of a sudden they drop them both and make something completely brand new. The same can go with moons and emotional needs. The same can go with Mars. Uranus conjunct Mars, though, needs to be careful, because we don't want to just be random for the sake of random, change for the sake of change, chaos for the sake of chaos. You know, we want to make sure that there's something mindful going on, so nobody's really losing their emotional footing or just getting swept up in it and seeing where it blows them. With Mercury and Uranus, we've got a lot more of an opportunity to change the way we actually view the world and communicate our observations. And most of the time this can be an innovative improvement on the social lives in the platonic and romantic sense for both people. Trines are all about reinventing the wheel, or updating that wheel and turning it into a rocket ship. With Uranus in trines, as well as sextiles, you know, you tend to find that maybe the Uranus person helps the other person in the situation, again, break a mold in that area of their life. Maybe it's helping them break a mold at work, or in their school, or in their religion. Maybe it's helping them break out of their shell in some aspect. However, when it comes to squares and oppositions, Uranus can be a destabilizing force, and sometimes it can go from turning the wheel into a rocket ship to blowing up that rocket ship if we're not careful. And that's because, again, Uranus is untamed. Uranus is kind of out of control. Uranus can also destabilize a person's sense of identity sometimes. Not necessarily in a bad way. Sometimes you see that this is actually a person does not conform to maybe the cultural or the traditional or the prescriptive values that they were raised into. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that, because there is no universal prescription for happiness. So, you know, if a person doesn't fall into the values of how a certain relationship or marriage is supposed to work, Uranus is going to be having a say in that. Now, in a trine or in a sextile, that can indicate, you know what, the other person is going to have an awakening to that being latent within themselves, and they're both going to feel free. However, in an opposition or a square, it can indicate a situation where another person could have a culture shock or a bit of a freak out by this person every now and again. Because sometimes what is valued by one flies in the face of, again, I guess you could say the cultural prescriptions that have been given to the other. And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it's not. If somebody has been given an unhealthy cultural prescription or an unhealthy cultural agreement, then that Uranus will smash it to pieces. The only problem with an opposition is that, well, Uranus doesn't always rebuild, and that can create a bit of instability. With squares, it's much less serious. It can indicate, again, things flying in the face, but at the same time, we can make both work as long as we don't get stuck on the shock, awe, and, you know, again, taken aback feeling of the fact that there's a controversy in the first place. That controversy may even be a special sexy spark when it comes to that kind of aspect and connection. Neptune is an interesting one for love and romance because Neptune can both be very, very romantic and sweet and very fulfilling. Neptune does talk a lot about higher love, higher communication, spiritual love, but it can also bring us to delusions, fantasies, and sometimes get us into a place where there could even be some addictive or dependent behavior. In trines, we tend not to see so much of that dependent behavior. Trines and sextiles, the harmonious aspects, tend to be a little bit more light. We tend to see more give and take, but more give on the part of the Neptune person. We see mutual support, and we see a lot of generosity and a lot of care and nurturing, as well as molding for both parties. Sextiles can even indicate a situation where a person may pop up, you know, a partner may actually be incredibly helpful and supportive and useful in another area of the other person's life, not even related to love. This can also bring a lot more romance, a lot more of a spiritual depth to the relationship in harmonious trines, again, as well, and as harmonious sextiles. So that can actually be the sweet side. However, conjunctions, normally neutral, can also indicate problems here. So neutral kind of goes dark. Neptunian conjunctions can indicate a situation where one person, typically the person who holds the Neptune, may actually become dependent on the other's planet or the other for whatever that planet does in the house that it functions in. Whether it's dependent, maybe even addicted to the love language with the Venus, or maybe dependent on the individual's problem-solving abilities with Mars, or possibly even dependent on the other person's need, interestingly enough, to feel useful, conjunct the Moon. This can be a very powerful psychic aspect, creating a very strong spiritual connection, but we don't want to get lost in each other. A loss of personal sense of self, sense of identity, being wholly consumed by the other person, or usually, which is the case with Neptune, sacrificing our individuality and letting ourselves be consumed, diving into the pool, so to speak, and never coming out. It's important to make sure that we keep, again, a sense of boundary where the other person begins and where the Neptune person begins. Oppositions can indicate a situation where a person is not feeling that their fantasies, drives, and dreams are being supported, or maybe they won't be supported by this person, whether they're artistic fantasies or artistic drives, spiritual goals, aspirations. And sometimes they can feel like they're being undermined. Maybe they're being undermined by somebody's problem-solving skills with Mars opposite Neptune. Maybe they're being undermined or feeling like they're being dismissed, or maybe being, stymied in some way by somebody's expression of love with Venus opposite Neptune. Sometimes they feel like they're being stymied by the other person's needs with Moon opposite Neptune. And it's important to reconcile, again, oppositions. People take turns with oppositions. You one day, me one day. You one day, me one day. The problem with Neptune energy here is that Neptune can lose a sense of proportion. And it's important to maintain that sense of proportion. Neptune can sometimes feel cheated even when there is a fair, equitable balance or maybe arrangement put in. Maybe, you know, for other planets and for other situations, you know, it could be the whole, you know, the idea of like, okay, well, we did what you want, now we're going to do what I want is great. And that works in other oppositions. Even Saturn oppositions work better. But with Neptune oppositions, it can often indicate a need to reinforce that truth because somebody may forget. Neptune can be fairly forgetful, or somebody may still feel cheated about the fact that it takes that routine or that arrangement to work in the first place. Because sometimes the Neptune delusion, or the Neptune idealist, can indicate, you know, again, it's not perfect in every single way, it's not flawless, therefore it's not good enough. But Neptune problems can lead to no relationships, not even ones that, you know, work. The problem with the Neptune opposition is that sometimes it can lead a person to believe, well, you know what, it's 95, it's not a 100, which is still an A, but that 5% just seems all the more glaring when it shouldn't. Neptune squares, again, squares can always be worked out. We don't have to trade, like with oppositions, but with squares we've got to find a way to blend and make everything work harmoniously at the same time. A person's expression of love with Venus and a person's Neptune fantasies and desires can work together even if they're coming in the wrong packages on the surface. And that's kind of the square. It's kind of like, oh, well, is it the right thing? Actually, it is the right thing. It's just not delivered the way I thought it was going to be delivered. Didn't come out the way I thought it was going to come out. Did not, you know, show up at the time I thought it was going to come. That's perfectly fine, as long as both parties know that that's kind of the typical situation and they come to understand and respect that. Neptune squares don't have to be a big deal at all. But if we're thrown off by that, okay, we're thrown off by maybe the uniqueness of each individual circumstance, where again, it may subvert expectations a little bit, then it's gonna create, again, some difficulty in the relationship finding a comfortable footing, especially in the beginning. Neptune energy, when it comes to, you know, a lot of this can also turn into, however, you know, a very close relationship to, again, dependence or addiction. Becoming addicted to certain things, or becoming focused on, again, the ideal of the dream person or the dream relationship. And if there's a difficulty, like a Neptune opposite Neptune, for instance, or if another person's Neptune is also creating difficulties with another person's Neptune and other things, we can have a challenge where a person may be focusing on, again, net results more than they should be focusing on building a unique experience with their own hands and their own unique partner. You know, sometimes, you know, and we've seen a lot of that, you know, sometimes people are taking constant appraisals. You know, they're trying to be relationship perfectionists. They are thinking more about the marriage than who they're married to. They're thinking more about the relationship than, you know, the ideal relationship endgame picture than what's going to get us there or how the relationship's functioning right now. And Neptune can have a lot to do with that because it can pull our focus away from the immediate and into the ideal. And we need to be able to keep a balance of both. Pluto is all about power, the expression of power. If Saturn is about authority and, you know, maybe restrictions, maybe problem solving, then Pluto is all about power. It is about, you know, it can have to do with a little bit of aggression. And it can also talk about obsession and sexuality. It's a very primal planet, not quite as ferocious as Mars, but it does talk about the shadow self and how that needs to also be integrated into our relationships. Harmonious Pluto connections include trines and sextiles, but also to a certain degree conjunctions are very harmonious. Pluto doesn't always have to be malefic. In fact, Pluto can actually be a very, very strong supporter of lifelong relations. And when we have Venus and Pluto conjunct, these people have the greatest sex, or we have the Moon and Pluto conjunct, you may actually have a person whose, shadow and a person's emotional needs both aim and go and jive with the same thing, allowing for almost instantaneous satisfaction. You may have a situation where maybe a Mars and a Pluto are conjunct. So again, problem solving and expression of power are very compatible. Just make sure that this couple doesn't nuke every other friend that they have, but they will be very effective. Maybe Pluto is conjunct the other person's Mercury. Again, people know what they're going to say before they even say it. This is probably the only aspect that I would actually say you could get away with saying, look, I shouldn't have to say it. You shouldn't have to say it with Pluto conjunct Mercury. That's the only mind reader aspect there is. So if a person's Pluto and Mercury is conjunct a person's Mercury, they could probably get away with the I shouldn't have to say it thing, because you probably could read a person's mind with that. Pluto being a very psychic planet and Mercury being the planet of communication. But that's it. And you know how rare that's going to be. Pluto in conjunctions most of the time is actually very, very awesome when it comes to the love planets. I don't want to talk about Pluto conjunct every single planet because, again, you should be studying that on your own. But, that's just a summation when it comes to the context of love. Pluto trines and sextiles can also indicate that one person's power basically gives another person support. One person's expression of power actually helps another person conquer, I guess you could say, almost an individually unstoppable problem in another area a lot of the time, whether it's, they're lending their power to knock over a big goal when it comes to, say, or a big obstacle to a goal, maybe financially, maybe socially. Pluto trine to a person's moon can indicate, this person just by, again, going out and solving their own problems, or again, maybe even intimately, sexually, or even by showing their vulnerable shadow self, or even their dark side, seems to satisfy that person's needs in a very, very fun way. When we think about that, there's almost a bit of a, there's a therapy that comes from the taboo experience with somebody that is safe, trustworthy, and accountable that can happen with that kind of connection, which is very, very sweet. And again, as long as everyone's safe, accountable, and responsible, there shouldn't be any problems. Pluto sextiles can indicate good that we want to keep an eye on, though. Here's the funny thing with sextiles. Remember, that's where they reach over and help the other thing. Pluto sextiles can sometimes show up where a person may step in to help a person out, but they may go a bit too far, and they have to make sure they don't go too far. It's kind of like going in and saying, like, if there's a fight or an argument with a relative that somebody's having, Pluto sextile, say somebody's Mars, might mean, okay, and then your wife gets on the phone at the other end of the house and chews out your family member with you. It's sweet, it's loyal, it's just a bit too much. And it does need to be reeled in just a little bit, but, the good intent is there. That help is also there because Pluto, in connection with love aspects, wants to help you take over the world. You just got to make sure, again, that we're keeping, again, the shadow self, or the shadow selves, if they're all connected to Pluto's here, in check and in balance. Pluto oppositions can create, again, struggles with power. Moon opposite or Venus opposite a person's Pluto could indicate half-successful satisfaction, which is almost worse than getting nothing at all for a lot of people, because it can indicate, again, the intimacy, the love, all of that kind of stuff can come through, but it may come with a price. It may be tainted to a certain degree, or it may be incomplete, because sometimes Pluto can deal with incompletions, especially if it's retrograde, either transiting or in the person's chart, or it can sometimes either be too much, or it could have something that, it's almost like there's a different spin that can create a transition or a transaction in this relationship that kind of changes the way people view each other for a while. Pluto is also a secret keeper, and so when we talk about secrets with Pluto oppositions can create problems, as well as Pluto squares, because, it could be that the person holding the Pluto could feel betrayed by maybe a very secretive person whose Venus or Moon or Mars is in opposition to that Pluto. Likewise, that Moon, Mars, or Venus, or Mercury on the other side, their holder may be feeling like that Pluto square or opposite them from the other person is prying, getting a bit intrusive or a bit invasive. So it's very important to make sure, again, we talk about rights, power, and the expression of that power in healthy, wholesome ways, and also making room for the light and shadow to work in this relationship. Now again, not everyone's going to have aspects to all of these planets all the time. You may find yourself with a partner that does not have any aspects to your Pluto or vice versa, which is fine. That's just not a dynamic your relationship will have, and there's nothing wrong with that. It may be better than having the problems that could come with a bad aspect after all. So that is an overview. I need to get a glass of water. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please, don't forget to do your independent studies with all these other videos that I've got on Patreon here, as well as the compatibility discussions of the sun signs on the Scarlet Moon horoscope page. All right, y'all take care, and I'll talk to you later.